The declaration did not originate from a liberal politician, a protest coordinator, a civil liberties attorney, or an immigration rights coalition, but rather it emerged from a conservative congresswoman, a Cuban-American descendant of parents who escaped a Marxist dictatorship with absolutely nothing, whose territory in South Florida remains one of the most densely Hispanic legislative districts nationwide, whose political alignment perfectly matches Stephen Miller's, whose name is Maria Elvira Salazar, and who during the spring of 2025 surveyed the framework Miller was constructing and voiced something that absolutely no individual within the conservative ranks had possessed the courage to utter publicly, choosing to proclaim it regardless. The message that ultimately resonated came from her peer, Florida State Senator Ileana Garcia, who serves Salazar's legislative territory within the state Senate, and since Garcia's parents represent Cuban exiles, she co-established Latinas for Trump, relentlessly campaigned for the executive branch, championed its strategies, and utilized her influence to generate backing for the political wave within the Hispanic population, only to witness removal sweeps striking her jurisdiction and observing the devastating impact on the citizens she was chosen to serve, prompting her to release a declaration stating that her Cuban exile parents are currently equally American, if not more so than Stephen Miller. The quote circulated rapidly because an adversary did not deliver it, but instead it originated from a former loyalist, a person whose parents achieved precisely what the naturalization framework is intended to honor by arriving lawfully, establishing a foundation, and embracing American identity, yet she was currently witnessing that identical framework being weaponized against populations who had pursued the exact same path using identical methods for identical motivations. Salazar had been pushing that exact perspective for an extended period using a distinct approach by relying upon legislative action. The Dignity Act of 2025 did not represent a fresh concept, considering Salazar had proposed variations of it during prior legislative terms. Yet in 2025, as massive removal sweeps accelerated nationwide, as employment sweeps targeted farming facilities, building zones, and dining establishments, as relatives were torn apart, and as people holding unresolved asylum applications faced removal prior to their judicial reviews, the legislation acquired an entirely new level of critical importance. The proposed law did not represent a blanket pardon, and Salazar maintained absolute clarity regarding this fact whenever any individual deployed that specific terminology. The Dignity Act mandated that undocumented migrants residing within the nation prior to 2021 must provide financial compensation, report consistently to Homeland Security, preserve spotless legal histories, and endure a waiting period of up to 7 years prior to securing any type of lawful standing, offering zero federal assistance, zero road to naturalization, and absolutely zero expedited options. The legislation additionally featured lasting boundary protection measures alongside a complete prohibition against unlawful behavior, making it, by any logical interpretation, a security-focused mandate accompanied by a compassionate component. Miller labeled the proposal as a blanket pardon. The vocabulary was hardly coincidental, since a blanket pardon serves as a highly specific phrase within naturalization debates, signifying absolution lacking repercussions, implying the statutes remain ignored, and functioning as rhetoric intended to terminate a dialogue rather than initiate one, which Miller deployed simply because the actual contents of the legislation proved significantly more difficult to debate against than a simple tag. Salazar refused to retreat from the tag, addressing it head-on when a conservative peer published a digital post branding the Dignity Act as a blanket pardon, prompting her to reply publicly that same afternoon with extreme precision, stating that labeling the bill a blanket pardon represents a profound inaccuracy, acts as an intentional misrepresentation, and reveals exactly how little comprehension he possessed regarding the legislation. She outlined the stipulations, highlighting the financial compensation, the clean legal history requirement, the 7-year timeline, the denial of federal assistance, and the complete lack of a naturalization route. Subsequently, she articulated a point that pierced the very core of the conflict, declaring that the southern boundary stood fortified, that the catastrophe of the preceding leadership had ceased, that the security successes were authentic, and that currently, having accomplished the protection objectives, The moment had arrived to evaluate the 11 million individuals who had resided and labored within this nation for years, contributing revenues, nurturing dependents, and establishing enterprises, to question what a genuinely robust naturalization strategy should practically execute regarding them. Widespread removal does not constitute a strategy, she declared, but rather it merely serves as a catchphrase. The financial reasoning was incredibly solid, as the National Association of Manufacturers had supported the Dignity Act, allowing Salazar to stand beside its leader during a media briefing and permit him to articulate the justification. American production facilities required laborers, farming enterprises were currently battling severe worker deficits, and building schedules were lengthening simply because the labor pool constructing them faced removal, meaning the very sectors employing Miller's backers were suffering profound damage due to the strategy Miller championed. Salazar delivered that specific point within the Conservative Assembly openly, consistently, and without any hesitation. Miller reacted by handling the legislation as a menace rather than a strategic dispute, viewing it as a menace because the Dignity Act embodied a concept his naturalization ideology refused to absorb, specifically the notion that security and compassion are not mutually exclusive, that a robust naturalization strategy can fortify the boundary while simultaneously treating the individuals currently present with respect, and that the term dignity does not signal a surrender to the opposition but rather accurately portrays the appearance of an operational framework. Miller had constructed his professional trajectory upon the assertion that these dual concepts remain mutually exclusive, that conferring any lawful standing upon an individual who crossed without permission acts as a prize for violating statutes, that the sole permissible resolution is banishment, and that any alternative represents a blanket pardon. Salazar's legislation confronted that ideology head-on, originating not from liberal factions but from deep within the conservative ranks, pushed by a congresswoman who cast a ballot for Trump, who endorsed boundary protection, and who had witnessed her own neighborhood molded by the fallout of disastrous naturalization strategies for numerous decades. The retaliation from Miller's supporters struck instantaneously, assembling a coalition to menace conservative politicians who backed the Dignity Act with internal electoral challenges, attaching the phrase blanket pardon to the legislation throughout every right-leaning broadcast segment that addressed the topic, and ensuring the intimidation remained severe and highly coordinated. Salazar refused to yield an inch. She matured, observing her parents establish a foundation in a nation that granted them the opportunity to succeed. She witnessed her community in South Florida molded by successive influxes of individuals arriving with nothing to construct meaningful legacies, and she observed the naturalization framework abandon those populations for decades, not due to overly rigid security, but because the lawful routes proved excessively restricted, overly sluggish, and deeply flawed to manage the truth of who currently populated the nation. The Dignity Act represented her solution to that systemic breakdown. Miller's rebuttal consisted of a solitary term, amnesty. Salazar possessed prior familiarity with the term, having listened to it weaponized to reject every legitimate naturalization overhaul initiative across 3 decades, having witnessed it terminate dialogues that desperately required occurrence, and having seen it destroy legislation that warranted a formal ballot. Yet she firmly decided against allowing it to destroy this particular effort. When Hispanic backing for Trump plummeted from almost 50% to approximately 33%, when surveys revealed 63% of Hispanic voters declaring the executive branch's naturalization tactics excessively harsh, and when the demographics that had furnished historic victories for the conservative faction in 2024 started indicating that the alliance faced severe tension, Salazar refrained from claiming she held the correct stance all along, choosing instead to declare that the current moment demands action, not because the partisan landscape shifted, but because the opportunity for a legitimate resolution was manifesting, recognizing that security lacking an overhaul fails to serve as a strategy, functioning instead as a continuous crisis, and continuous crises fail to construct the type of solid operational naturalization framework that any rational individual on either end of the dispute genuinely desires. Maria Elvira Salazar does not serve as Stephen Miller's adversary, but rather she operates as his peer, sharing the identical legislative group, casting ballots alongside the identical faction, and serving a territory that provided Donald Trump with an exceptionally dominant outcome in Florida. Yet she evaluated the system Miller constructed and declared it inadequate, not due to excessive brutality, but because it lacks substantive seriousness. Seriousness requires simultaneous security and respect. Seriousness requires questioning how to practically handle 11 million individuals who have resided here for years. Seriousness requires heeding the factory owners, the agricultural producers, the building contractors, and the dining proprietors who continually warn that the labor pool is vanishing and operations are stalling. And seriousness requires mirroring the actions her parents undertook upon arriving in this nation by establishing a permanent foundation. Miller branded it a blanket pardon, while Salazar branded it the Dignity Act. Proving the distinction between those dual phrases represents the gap separating a catchphrase from a concrete strategy, and within the conservative ranks, a single congresswoman hailing from South Florida concluded that the distinction holds enough significance to warrant a fierce battle. An additional crucial element requires comprehension regarding Salazar's actions and why her approach diverges from every prior conservative endeavor to overhaul naturalization, considering past endeavors arrived burdened with regrets, with hesitation, and with cautious separation from the core voters, rendering the endeavor politically survivable yet functionally impotent. Conservatives desiring an overhaul dedicated years attempting to discover phrasing that permitted them to back a bill without facing accusations of weakness regarding naturalization, tweaking the narrative, diluting the stipulations, and appending security mandates so exhaustive that the legislation ceased executing its intended purpose, only to inevitably face accusations of weakness regarding naturalization regardless. Salazar avoids employing that tactic, choosing instead to plant herself squarely within the center of her own faction to state explicitly that widespread removal fails to constitute a strategy, that labeling everything a blanket pardon serves as an intentional misrepresentation, that the financial justification for an overhaul remains authentic, and that the very sectors energizing conservative territories are the exact ones suffering damage from the present methodology. She argues the case based upon its actual value, refusing to seek authorization to present it, refusing to dilute it to weather the inevitable fury, and merely presenting it boldly, which entirely breaks from the historical behavior of conservative naturalization overhaul advocates, explaining exactly why Miller remains unable to brush her aside in the identical manner he brushed aside past initiatives, since those past initiatives arrived with sufficient hesitation to ensure the negative tags adhered permanently. The Dignity Act lacks that vulnerability, boasting security mandates, legal history benchmarks, financial compensation duties, and a 7-year timeline, alongside the backing of the National Association of Manufacturers, a co-sponsor originating from Texas, and the endorsement of the demographics that handed the conservative faction its most robust Hispanic margins in an entire generation. Miller wields a catchphrase while Salazar wields legislation, and deep inside the conservative ranks during the spring of 2026, the conflict between those dual entities remains far from concluded, as it is merely commencing.